Can ghosts die? Only the Alans can answer that. They rode out of the steppe like ghosts on horseback. Empires buried them, yet they rose again. Again and again they returned, striking with fury until their name was carved into history forever. But the Alans are not the only warriors who fought their way into history. If you want to uncover more stories like this, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss them. However, today we uncover the story of the Alans, the nomads the world could not kill. The story of the Alans begins in the Eurasian steppe, their first homeland. Ancient geographers placed them in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the boundless grasslands between the Don River and the Caspian-Volga basin, a land where survival was carved from wind and steel. The Alans were Iranian-speaking people, but it was not their tongue that etched their name into history. It was their way of life. They were nomads. They lived as a pastoral society, bound to cattle, horses, and the endless migration of seasons. But their lives were never just about cattle or milk. The harsh weather and war hardened them. For the Alans, war was not a part of life. War was life. And so they became a terror on horseback. Their cavalry was the pride of the steppe. Heavy horsemen covered in scale or lamellar armor, horse and rider fused together into one living wall of iron. With long lances, they shattered enemy lines. Beside them rode swift horse archers, cunning and merciless. They could vanish in feigned retreats, only to circle back like a storm and strike from the flanks. To fight the Alans was to face an enemy who was everywhere and nowhere, always moving, never yielding. Because of their cavalry, their fame spread far beyond the steppe. They became one of the greatest mounted forces of ancient times. So great was their skill that even Rome, master of armies, began to copy them. Roman cavalry adopted Alan weapons, armor, and tactics, hoping that by imitation they might steal the Alans' power. But for the Alans, this was only the beginning. For the Alans, the steppe was never a cage. From as early as the 1st century BCE, Hellenic horsemen were riding far beyond their pastures. Sometimes they rode as mercenaries, other times as raiders. But wherever they appeared, they left their mark. Josephus, the Jewish historian, records how around 72 CE, an Alan horde burst through the narrow gates of the Caucasus into Media, flooding foreign lands like an avalanche. In 135 CE, another Alan host rode even farther, striking Armenia and Cappadocia. These were not accidental raids. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Alans became a constant menace, harassing Roman provinces and Sasanian strongholds again and again. Yet the same fury that made them terrifying also made them irresistible allies. Roman emperors, who once trembled at their raids, began to recruit Alan lancers into their own armies. And by the 3rd and 4th centuries, Alans were no longer only enemies at the gates. They stood inside Rome's armies, fighting for emperors they might once have raided. For a while, it seemed the Alans had found a balance between free riders of the steppe and warriors in the Roman imperial service. But in the late 4th century, a new power rose out of the east and shattered the Alans' world forever. In the 370s, the Alans' dominion on the steppe came crashing down. The Huns surged from the east, bursting across the Volga and cutting down everything in their path. The Alans were the first to face their fury, and the clash was brutal. Ammianus Marcellinus, the Roman historian, records that the Huns traversed the territories of the Alani, east of the Don. Many Alans were slaughtered in battle, others were captured and forced into the Hunnic armies. Some remained in the Caucasus, forming the ancestors of the Ossets, who still survive today. Others fled westward, carrying their name and their pride into new lands. By 376, fragments of the Alans were already appearing among the displaced peoples crossing the Danube into Roman Thrace. But most remained in the steppe, waiting and enduring until the great crossing of the Rhine in 406, when their name would thunder into history once again. On that icy threshold of the Rhine, the people of Alan were split in different directions. One part, led by an Alan leader named Respendiel, crossed the Rhine with the Vandals and the Suebi. Together, they stormed into Gaul and later pushed into Hispania. Some went with another leader called Goar, who allied himself with Rome. Others drifted to Spain, attaching themselves to the Suebi in Iberia. And some stayed with the Goths, fighting as mercenaries or living as settlers under foreign lords. But far away, in the deep Caucasus, some Alans chose not to go west. They endured under the pressure of the Huns. They would later rise as the medieval kingdom of Alania, and from them would come the Ossetians, the last living heirs of the Alans. And so the Alans, who were once a single people of the steppe, became many branches woven into the lands of Europe and Asia. And each of these branches carried its own story into history. After the separation at the Rhine crossing in 406 CE, some Alans followed Alan king, Goar. Ancient writers like Olympiodorus tell us he separated himself from his fellows and turned to Rome instead. During this time, the Roman Empire was weakened by civil wars and invasions, so they accepted his offer. The Alans of Goar became foederati, federate allies of Rome, settling in Rome as guardians. The Loire Valley and the city of Orleans, lands in the northern Gaul, became their new heartland. From here, Alan horsemen served in Roman campaigns. Their iron-clad riders acted as a stabilizing force for the Roman Empire. In the 400s, the great Roman general Flavius Aetius, who had once lived as a hostage among Huns and Goths, used Goar's Alans to hold a chain of garrisons from Orleans along the Loire. He knew well the worth of steppe cavalry, so he used them as a shield against rebels and foes of Rome. And Orleans became the stronghold of the Alans and Goar's seat of power. Throughout the 440s, the Alans of Gaul intervened in local crises on Rome's behalf. But all of this reached a climax in 451, when Attila, commander of the Hunnic army, swept into Gaul. Flavius Aetius summoned every federate ally. Goar's successor, Sangiban, marched his Alans to Aetius's coalition. Yet Jordanes, writing in 551, records that Sangiban had secretly promised to betray the city of Orleans to Attila. So Aetius watched him with suspicion. He placed the Alans in the very center of the Roman line at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, both to bear the brunt of Attila's assault and to keep Sangiban under watch. Attila urged his warriors to attack the Alani first, and the Alan ranks bore the brunt of the onslaught. The fighting was savage, yet the Roman and Visigothic wings held firm, turning the tide and halting Attila's advance on Orleans. After that day, the light of the Alans in Gaul dimmed. Sangiban vanished from the record, never to be heard again. By the late 5th century, Alan kings were gone, their name dissolving into the Armoricans and the Franks. The once proud horsemen of the steppe had been swallowed by Gaul, But while Guar's Alans faded into the Gaulish society, another Alan host rode south. In 409, the Vandals, Suebi, and Respendios Alans forced their way over the Pyrenees into Hispania. They divided the land amongst themselves. The Alans, under their king Adac, who is Respendios' successor, received Lusitania and Carthaginensis, roughly today's Portugal and central Spain, while the Siling Vandals took Baetica in the south. For a brief moment, a new Alan kingdom was born. This autonomy, however, soon brought confrontation with Roman authority. Emperor Honorius called on his Gothic allies, the Visigoths under King Wallia, to reclaim Hispania. In 416, Wallia descended upon the land with merciless force. First, the Siling Vandals were destroyed, then the Alans faced the same fate. Adac himself was slain in battle in 418. Hydatius tells us that the survivors fled into the arms of the Vandals under King Gunderic. The Vandals absorbed their remnants into their host. And by the time the Vandals were crossing into North Africa in the 420s, their kings bore the formal title Rex Vandalorum et Alanorum, which means King of the Vandals and Alans. By the mid-5th century, the Alans of the West had reached their fateful ends. A people once united on the steppe now existed only as echoes, a name in Vandal titles, a shadow in Gaulish villages, and a living remnant far away in the Caucasus, where the Ossetians would keep the flame. The Alans who survived in Hispania fled to the Vandals, tying their fate forever to the Hasding Vandals under King Gunderic, and later his brother Gaiseric. In 429 CE, Gaiseric made a daring gamble. He led his mixed host of Vandals and Alans across the Strait of Gibraltar into Roman North Africa. Together they crossed perhaps 80,000 strong men, organized into 80 divisions so that Vandals and Alans fought as one. From the very start, the Alans were the heart of the Vandal march. They marched upon Africa, and Africa fell step by step. They besieged cities, including Hippo-Regius in 430, where Augustine, the great bishop, died as the walls shook under Vandal-Alan assault. A few years later, in 439, Gaiseric struck a final blow that changed everything. Carthage fell, and the invaders transformed themselves into rulers. Rome was forced to recognize them by treaty in 442, ceding Africa's richest provinces to this new Vandal-Alan kingdom. From Carthage, their power spread across the sea. Olive oil and grain that once filled Rome's storehouses now enriched Gaiseric's coffers. The Alan cavalry made them feared on land. At sea, their new fleet, built with timber from the Atlas Mountains, terrorized the western Mediterranean. Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearics fell under their reach. In 455, their ships even sailed into Rome itself, looting the Eternal City and carrying away her treasures. The Alans were no longer nomads on the steppe. They were now part of a Mediterranean empire. Every king of this dynasty bore the proud title King of the Vandals and Alans. Procopius later wrote that the different names of tribes had fused into one. All were called Vandals. Yet the royal title kept alive the truth that the Alans had not vanished, but had built this kingdom with their own blood. But even at this height of power, cracks appeared. Their Arian faith set them against the Catholic majority of Africa. Huneric, 477 to 484, son of Gaiseric, unleashed bitter persecutions upon the church. The Alans became rulers who crushed faith with edicts and fire. Under Gunthamund, 484 to 496, and Thrasimund, 496 to 523. Moderation returned, but the kingdom never regained Geiseric's iron strength. Hilderic, 523 to 530, leaned toward Rome and Catholicism, alienating his own nobility. He was deposed by his cousin Gelimer, but the quarrel gave Emperor Justinian the excuse he needed. In 533, his general Belisarius landed in Africa with a mere 15,000 men. Twice he met the Vandal-Alan armies in open battle, first at Ad Decimum, then at Trachamarum, and twice he crushed them. By 534, the kingdom was gone. Gelimer fled, was hunted down, and surrendered. Carthage was retaken almost untouched. Some Vandals and Alans were slaughtered, others were shipped east and resettled in Asia Minor, where they soon faded into the local peoples. A few mingled with Berbers and Roman Africans, their names slowly lost to time. That was how the Vandal-Alan kingdom ended. For 100 years, it had ruled Rome's richest provinces, commanded fleets, and humbled empires. But its fall was swift, its extinction nearly absolute. The Alans, who once thundered across the steppe as free horsemen, now disappeared into the silence of history, remembered only in titles, chronicles, and echoes of their vanished name. For a time, it seemed as though the Alans had been erased from history. Their kingdom in Hispania was crushed by the Visigoths in 418. Their joint throne with the Vandals in North Africa was wiped away by the Eastern Romans in 534. In the chronicles of the West, their name had faded, as though history itself had buried them. But the Alans were not gone, not entirely. Some still lived in their ancient homeland. They never left. They lived in the high, wild Caucasus between the Black and Caspian seas. And from there, they would shape one of the longest stories of survival in steppe history. By the middle of the 5th century, after the terror of the Huns had passed, they held the fertile northern slopes of the Caucasus. Their power stretched from the upper Kuban River to the Darial Gorge, a passage so vital that ancient writers called it the Gate of the Alans. Here they began to change. They were no longer only riders of the grasslands, but guardians of the highlands. And soon the world began to notice their strength again. From the 6th century onward, Alanic kings made alliances with Byzantium, Georgia, Abkhazia, and the Khazars. Alan princesses married into foreign dynasties. Byzantine records even tell of Alan princesses who became queens and empresses. The most famous, Maria of Alania, rose to the throne of Constantinople in the 11th century. Through such ties, the Alans walked the halls of emperors. Religion also reshaped their identity. From the 5th century, missionaries brought Christianity to the Alans in the mountains. At first, the common people still clung to their old fires and sun spirits, but gradually, the nobles embraced Christianity. By the early 900s, the conversion was official. In 914, the Patriarch of Constantinople wrote to a new Alan bishop, welcoming the kingdom into the Orthodox Church. Stone churches began to rise in the valleys of Akis, Senti, and Shawana, many still standing today, weathered but unbroken. By the 11th century, Alania stood firmly within the Orthodox Christian world. Geographically, the Alans controlled the Darial Pass, which was called Bab al-Lan in Arabic and Dar-e-Alan in Persian. It was known as the Gate of the Alans, which linked the Eurasian steppe to the rich lands of Transcaucasia. Whoever held it controlled both caravans and armies. Arab geographer Al-Mas'ud, writing in the 10th century, claimed the Alan king could summon 30,000 cavalry. Another source, the Persian Hudud al-Alam, circa 982, described Alania as a vast country with 1,000 settlements, part Christian, part pagan, but thriving and powerful. Far from being a relic of the past, medieval Alania was a kingdom of wealth, strength, and prestige. But their mountains did not keep them safe. During the Arab-Khazar Wars of the 700s, the Alans were dragged into the struggle, often fighting beside their Khazar overlords. Arab raids left scars. In 857, a caliphal army swept through, burning and killing. Yet the Alans recovered, and by the 800s they had thrown off Khazar rule, standing as an independent kingdom once more. Their loyalty turned to Byzantium and Georgia, and their Christian faith deepened. From then on, they guarded the Caucasus frontier against nomadic raiders like the Pechenegs and Kipchaks. And even then, their cavalry still made them feared by empires. Alan horsemen were not only defenders, but also sought-after allies. In 1033, Alan riders joined Prince Mstislav of Tmutarakan, a Russia's prince on the Black Sea, in raiding Shirvan, likely urged on by Byzantium. But the greatest threat against their kingdom came in the 13th century with the attack of the Mongols. In 1221, they struck the Alans with devastating force. A generation later, in 1239 to 1240, Batu Khan of the Golden Horde returned. His armies besieged Magas, the Alan capital. Chronicler Juvayni wrote that the city was heavily fortified and resisted bravely, but in the end, the walls fell. The Mongols stormed the city, slaughtering its people. Ibn al-Athar mourned that the Tatars massacred the Alans and committed many outrages. With Magas destroyed, the kingdom of Alania collapsed. But still, the people did not vanish. Survivors fled deeper into the mountains, breaking into smaller clans, yet keeping their tongue and memory alive. These scattered groups became the Ossetians, the Iron in the east and the Dagur in the west. Their language, Ossetic, still carries the words of their Alan ancestors. Their epic tales, the Nart sagas, echo with the voices of long-gone heroes. Even after the Mongols and Timur tried to erase them, they endured. Today, the Ossetians still call themselves heirs of Alania. For them, Alania is a living flame. It is the root of their identity, a symbol of survival, faith, and pride. From steppe nomads to mountain kings, from ruin to rebirth, the Alans lived on in the Caucasus, their story carved into stone churches, mountain passes, and the living tongue of their descendants. The world thought the Alans had ended. Yet from the Caucasus, they rose again as ghosts that history could not bury